So this will be one of the last talks to cap off a very concentrated period of thinking for us all. But I have a point to share, or a couple points actually, that hopefully will not require an intense focus from your mind, but more a shift of perspective. Now, the electric universe dialogue serves different purposes to different parties, but it adds up to a stronger sum with each separate conversation within it. It is a gathering of evidence that widens the cognitive peripheral vision of our species. When I think of this group, I draw an analogy to walking in the redwood forest. The paths there are usually wide enough for old logging trucks back in the day, so instead of walking single file with one person leading the rest, we would often be spread out across the width of the path. And on different sides, people might notice different things. On one side, the people might have a gully, or they might have giant trees reaching up into the sky, and they'd get an appreciation for the neck-straining height, the true scale of the highs and the lows. The people on this side of the trail, they have a view of the big scale, the grandness of life. They often feel small by comparison. Then on the other side of the trail, a rise in the terrain can bring many of the tiniest creatures and their intricate landscapes to eye level. And often we see some parallel, such as the tiniest mosses can resemble the ferns that at our scale are, this high, and we see all of these tiny, often alien-looking creatures in their own little world. It's like looking inside a Fabergé egg, and it's all a product of the same molecules and atoms. It's the same reality, but it's utterly invisible when we are studying these largest scales of reality. And through such advancement, in our highly complementary discussions, highly varied but also complementary, we advance the overall discourse of how scientists relate to their topics. When we have this broad-angle lens and all of these different discussions on our different sides of the path, we're all advancing forward together. We can change, with a broad-angle lens, we can overall advance the cultural wisdom of our species. So, just to take a look at physical life forms from the EU perspective, not to be reductionistic, even if our title is Elegant Simplicity, but to point out some interesting things, to look at the supposedly familiar creatures around us, and to see them with fresh eyes. Say, is there anything we should add to the significant knowledge found in your average biology textbook? So, here is the general Lego piece of all life forms we see. Starting in 1665 with Robert Hooke, humans have been calling them cells, because in his time they reminded him of the cellula, little rooms that monks would live in. And to me, using a title like cell or room, it's a hallmark of when our understanding of these structures was also small. They're much more like kingdoms, or it's like castles or kingdoms even, because within all their organelles, they manage a staggering complexity of the movement of the most basic molecules and atoms of life operating at timescales that seem otherworldly to us. And yet this is happening in every moment at sheerly astounding scales in every finger digit of our body or every pigeon that we find annoying. This is this ever-present scale of reality we simply do not see with the naked eye. So I would like to help people visualize this layer of reality a little bit better as it is. I have an appreciation for it, because no models in a classroom using plastic balls and sticks will really allow us to visualize the otherworldly timescales that we are made of at this most fundamental level. National Geographic mentioned one estimate of how many cells are in a human body. Just an average estimate, very well researched, about 37 trillion. So 37 trillion. It's amazing what a single cell can become under the right conditions. So we are much more like galaxies of cells than our embodied human perspective would appreciate as we're interacting with people and creatures. We are surely immense galaxies of cells. Only galaxies, when we're talking billions of stars, we're talking in the trillions of cells. Now, one discovery about cells that humans will soon start to spread and utilize is the awareness that an organism regulates even the morphogenesis, the form of its cells and tissues, using charge gradients across cellular membranes. If a cell becomes depolarized, that is, if it loses its healthy electric membrane potential, say 60 millivolts across a membrane, it enters a state that we call cancer. So depolarization of the cell is cancer. Now, this might be because the shift in potential causes many specific problems, such as the inability to allow in particular charged molecules that can regulate cellular growth. So there are many specific, nuanced factors that can be occurring in this process. The Levin Lab at Tufts University, named after its principal researcher, Michael Levin, has witnessed a revolution in our species' understanding of the electrical nature of cell morphology and communication. First, they made great strides in cancer treatment, showing that if membrane potentials in cancer cells are returned to a healthy state of polarity, then cancers could simply become healthy tissue again. Or they would recognize they aren't supposed to be there and planned cell death would happen and they would go, bleh. Though because they did some very excellent work and got some very encouraging findings, but because this is still such a complex subject, still a bit of art and luck, the science of it is so in the developing stages. So many things we have yet to map out. Their success rate is still very low. Say, in one experiment, curing just small animals, they had about a 30% success rate using just the methods that they were seeking to show the efficacy of, just altering flow through ion channels to change the polarity of cells. But still 30% in about 24 hours or so could possibly remiss cancers. That is already something that a lot of people would like to try before they engage in a treatment that might possibly be the death of them. So, if nothing else, would be very expensive and difficult for their family. So, this is already good and highly promising for future research. And on their website, you'll see they've been quite busy. So looking at this layer of cells and this new technology, they've, since 2012, they've been publishing about an average of 19 papers every year. So they are blazing a trail forward. And now something equally interesting they discovered, and far more shocking, but in a very positive way. Specific tissue types, or even full body parts, can actually be induced to form on purpose in areas they were previously not thought capable of supporting them. By replicating the voltage gradients associated with that organ's normal placement in the body, one can actually induce that organ to grow. This was discussing a press release. Researchers discover that changes in bioelectric signals trigger the formation of new organs. This is truly a world of the future for human technology and our relation to life. Now, this comes from a number of studies, including one where they made tadpoles grow an eye on their tail, and also one inside their gut. And somehow, the body of these creatures did all sorts of heavy lifting for them, not only with their, admittedly highly specific and practiced regulation of cellular membrane potentials to kick off this process. Nonetheless, the body did all of this work to form this complex eye, just like you'd see on the outside of the body. And furthermore, it neurologically connected it to the brain. So these tadpoles apparently could see with this tail eye, or this eye in their gut. And I know some scientists will probably want to play around with this as soon as possible, but let's be kind to... And just to remember, going back Many other researchers involved. I think I put a note at the bottom here. It really takes a village to raise an experiment, as we've seen from the presentations here. So, once again, tadpole with an eye. And I'm sure a lot of people, when they hear about experiments like this, their first reaction to scientists, how they see people doing this research is something like this.
I have created things that will change the world for the better. For instance, here is a monkey with 4 asses.
How does that make the world better?
That is a very legitimate question. But that research, just that little example of making tadpoles grow butt eyes or eyes inside their stomachs, this has increased understanding about neurology in the brain and how we could, in the future, be able to, we, the scientists who specialize this, coordinating with the medical infrastructure of our age, we could heal birth defects like the loss of an eye. Lives could be changed through these seemingly bizarre, trivial experiments. Well, bizarre and trivial to some people. They, sharing these experiments with the wider public. In related regenerative work, the researchers at Tufts have been creating detailed computer models of regeneration, like this picture of the classic planaria. And I think it is very much in line with the electric universe discussions to now think of ourselves and other creatures we see as these galaxies of cells, these basically large, to give humans that understanding, the vastness of what each person or creature is. Galaxies of cells organized keenly by electric charge gradients across cellular membranes all throughout this body. We are very intimately organized by electrical forces and can be healed by electrical forces. And some of these beings, some of our fellow Earthlings, can feel the Earth's magnetosphere, and this influences behavior in a variety of ways. If you've watched my videos, the turtles, as I discussed, the leatherback turtles, they create their nests in particular places in accordance with the geomagnetic field, and their nest placement will shift based on the shifting of the geomagnetic field. And if you've done research on your own, just looking across the internet, probably many of you interested in the subject have come across articles discussing how dogs, they were studied and found that many dogs, they would poop in accordance, I forget how they tested this now, but yes, indeed, how would they test this? But finding that even behavior like that, of say, maybe where they wanted to mark their territory, that this is such an intricate sense that these beings that would be consulting this. And of course, the one thing that we humans have definitely noticed when looking at the animal kingdom, and even ourselves, is the ability to navigate using this connection to the geomagnetic field. And yes, many humans, under the right conditions, and with the right sufficiently skilled experimenter, you can do experiments and see that humans have not lost this sense. Maybe some of us are not keyed into it as much. Maybe we haven't been, haven't had a need or haven't had a clean environment around us from some factors to feel the geomagnetic field. But from bacteria all the way up to sentient life forms like ourselves, this is just an intricate, it's a fact of life that one can study. Now let's take a fresh look at some of our many fellow organisms, just a small view of the variety that inhabit this planet, keeping in mind that these are all vast galaxies of cells organized by electric gradients into many forms. Yes, birds can do that.
practices his display, and this one pretends like it's watching, and then they switch. And this goes on hours at a time during the day, for months out of the year, for many years. And so only then, when they transition into their first adult plumage, do they start doing this thing that we recognize as the full courtship display.
They were acting like a taser, essentially causing involuntary muscle contractions to freeze up the animal so it couldn't move. The eel is remotely activating motor neuron output that activates muscles. So they're essentially reaching into the animal's nervous system with their electric charge and remotely controlling their muscles through their peripheral nervous system, which I think is pretty amazing.
What was nature thinking?
Because they're awake all night, it's a little difficult taking care of them in a studio apartment. And then occasionally at night they'll bark if they want your attention. Like when they first wake up, they want to see you.
So I figured I wouldn't put anything too savage up on a giant screen as you're forced to watch it. You know, no Clockwork Orange effect here. But yes, also the cuteness of nature doesn't get seen enough sometimes. Now, considering that the human can have around 37 trillion cells, just imagine these. I wonder what sort of pathologies they had in a body this large, with so much distance for cellular communication to travel. With this mindfulness of the fundamental unit of all organisms, like ourselves, let's consider a different note. How do life forms fit into the larger electric universe that has spawned them? Are we, they, are it all life forms, are we just simply tangential, kind of unconnected, an epiphenomena? Or do we also complement larger systems in some interesting ways? Now, beavers are a very easy example of how organisms can have a substantial impact on their surroundings. Beavers build channels, waterways, into new areas. They make waterways much deeper, and this causes water to remain during hot seasons with a lot of evaporation, where all these liquids would be evaporating away on the planet's surface. And this is a bit of press material because there are some places where they'd have huge droughts, and this would drastically affect farmers, and the only places where they would have water remaining are in ponds where there were beavers. So we can already see how this is affecting a supposedly much more advanced life form like ourselves. They are they are terraformers, even at this level of the animal kingdom. And they do increase the reach of waterways, so they within just a few decades, thanks to a family or two of beavers, you can suddenly have a patch of earth that was arid and desert-like, and then these beavers will take tiny streams where there is barely a trickle in most seasons, and when there is water there, they can come in and dig it deeper and widen it, and especially just deepen it so that the water is retained better, and they can suddenly, ecologists can come into an area that was just desert and could not sustain life, and then the traveling beavers coming in to do their thing, it has all of this grass, it's just lush, can support all of these forms of life that somehow find their way there, and it's a little oasis. And it's good to keep in mind for humans when we learn to more intelligently use these relationships, as we're all these creatures born of this particular world and all of its electrical terrain, all of its electrical atmosphere that we creatures can call on the skills of each other, such as for terraforming and making some place lush, and maybe we can grow food for populations that otherwise would be starving and you'd have to ship food in. And so just something to consider. And before we consider the largest scale, at which organisms of trillions of cells can reshape their surroundings, consider these effects in a more complex case.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So here we had rivers, the very geography of a world, affected in a way they otherwise wouldn't be by the electric organisms that evolved on it, and all of the trees on mountains, trees large and small, working to stabilize and alter how the liquids could flow upon this planet's surface, and quite a exponential effect on life, where now you have other life forms evolve that can eat the trees in potentially disastrous ways, but then these other life forms can scare them off, alter their behavior so that the trees are maintained in their populations that continue to help craft the planet's surface. And I think this is a very interesting interaction effect. And humans are very much a part of all of this. Our species can be a self-regulating one, and highly directed, too. Now, we have a long history of coming into a state of maturity towards our surroundings. Kind of like the deer, we can have that urge to vacuum up all of the foliage, and for completely understandable, sometimes people can be greedy, but then otherwise there's all sorts of other reasons that people are socialized or are, out of desperation of resources, driven to do these sort of things. So as we grow as a species, we can help each other by taking the best practices and best knowledge and the benefits or privileges from one place or another and try to, try to disseminate them more evenly. And humans can remove or add to the terrain. We are great terraformers. We can also contaminate the terrain. And our collective species can act like beavers, but on a planetary scale. So here we are, a creature born of this planet that can now reshape or change the conditions of this planet in remarkable ways. If you want to influence the state of the Earth biosphere, either depressing or inspiring the human species offers a direct route. So once humans have become more intelligently compassionate towards our own species and towards our surroundings, towards our home planet, we can evolve our technology and our intellect for interplanetary creative adventures one day. This seems like the trajectory of our people. One day, I'm sure we will introduce ecosystems on once barren planets, and for all the right reasons too, say not just in pursuit of one particular atomic compound that a few people can sell to make a lot of money and still not find true happiness, how it is. Now, I personally, though, am quite content to keep exploring this planet. According to the research of Robert Hazen, we have probably around, in very good research I might add, probably have around 1,500 minerals that are as yet undiscovered. And around 20% of the world's vascular plants are still undocumented and not really known and understood to science, to say nothing of what little surprises can always come up in the supposedly familiar, supposedly known. And meanwhile, the number of undocumented or fully unnoticed species is actually many times the amount that we know and understand. And each of these creatures often has remarkable, well, not every single one, but each of these creatures could potentially have remarkable innovations, lessons that they could teach us in medicine from their biochemistry, in engineering, in materials science. There are all sorts of things that we learn from the evolutionary novelty around us, such as the classic case of, spider silk and different things where when we're adapting materials to from one part of the animal kingdom, trying to produce them differently and adapt them for some other use. And one day, our degree of understanding of bioelectrical morphology and genetics will probably give us the power to replicate design elements from different creatures. We might augment ourselves, or we might augment other species with new degrees and types, say, of sensory perception, like bat ears, for instance. Just pointing out what we're already seeing the beginnings of in some of these technologies. Humans are probably destined, amongst all the emptiness of space, we really ought to understand the value of our home planet's many life forms, of all of the beautiful evolutionary novelty that is living all around us. Humans are just starting to also communicate with other intelligent animals on this planet. There are literally so many frontiers that we are just beginning to explore and have yet to truly appreciate and prepare ourselves for. And someday we'll probably become terraformers of other worlds, like space beavers. But first, of course, we must continue to grow emotionally and intellectually, transformed by difficult challenges into something wiser. In the long run, we are an animal perfectly suited to the stewardship of other animals and the conscious management of all the treasures of life on this planet, empowered by knowledge of the physics of life. And I just want to say thank you all for lending your presence to this particular conference of science.